From the fiction, we have back with us today the ever-popular Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst and former advisor to Secretary of Defense and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, welcome back.
Hey, thanks.
Well, listen, let's get right into this part here because, wow, I mean, if you've been watching this war since last February, people may be a little surprised to find out that we are in firm control of this, but that's what the President of the United States had to say this morning.
The only one that has control of the Strait of Hormuz right now is the United States Navy. We have a blockade that's been infallible. It's a steel wall. And we let people in that we want to let in, and those people come in, and they've been coming in and they're going out. So it's actually open now. We do not let them go into Iran.
So, okay, if we have a blockade, it is effective. It's not foolproof, but it is effective at largely stopping Iranian transports out or stuff into Iran. That part is true. But I mean, to say that we're in control of it and that we decide what comes in and what goes out and that it's open, I mean, how do you get by with that now in nearly the 6 month of war?
Well, I think we have to say that the traffic is down by a factor of 90% from what it was before the war, any way you calculate it. That's nothing short of a disaster for the global economy. So if his, principal aim is to somehow or another harm or sabotage or subvert the global economy, I think that's working very well. As far as influencing Iran, there's no evidence that anything we're doing is influencing Iran at this point.
And the question is that going to change? I mean, what is happening right now? Because actually, I got one more here from President Trump. I said this morning, it was yesterday. But he's saying, listen, we're kind of taking a low-key approach to this and we're semi-negotiating.
They asked for reparations, you might say, or they asked for money for the damage that we've done. I said, that's a good idea. Well, we're going to ask for money for the damage they've done over a 50-year period.
The president's new strategy is to inflict maximum economic pain on the country. The Treasury is tightening its grip with more sanctions on the regime.
We are low-keying it militarily, adding, we are only semi-negotiating with them. We're just watching Iran with its huge inflation and the fact they have no money.
Now, again, the blockade is having a negative effect on Iran, and it is causing inflation and several other things. But is that going to be enough to cause them to have economic hardship before our economic hardship hits harder?
I think that's the right question, and I think the answer is no. It's going to hit us very hard in the fall, as we've talked about. All the effects of the downturn in traffic to the Strait of Hormuz. The fact that 40% of the world's sulfur comes out of the strait and none of it's coming out, all these kinds of things. And I think that Donald Trump should consider writing a new book. I think his last book was The Art of the Deal. He's an expert now. He should sit down and write a book called The Art of Defeat, because that's what he's mastered. We are defeated. And nothing he does at this point is going to make any difference. And the Iranians have made that very clear. That's why they said they have no intention of negotiating with this administration. They'll wait until he leaves office, presumably in 2029. I think he might go earlier. But having said that, they know that we are not governed per se by Donald Trump or the voice of the American people. These institutions and the people in them have all been purchased by the Zionist Jewish billionaires who are actually in control. And there's no point in talking to them. You might as well try to talk to Netanyahu. And I think they know that's a waste of time.
Let's take a look at some of the economic stuff here, because there is a school of thought that there are those here, and we're going to see some of those voices later in this show that are saying, hey, there's economic pain on Iran, and there's some on us too, but it's going to hit them harder. But there is one factor. You mentioned the fertilizer. There's another factor that's right now with jet fuel. Is actually getting closer to being a critical issue. There have been some analysts I saw just yesterday that said there's maybe 3 or 4 weeks left that can handle the current economic activity at the current status. And then they're going to have to start curtailing and cutting out, either dramatically raising the price of airline traffic, and that's everything, not just passengers, but also transport, et cetera. Or they're going to have to start cutting routes because they just physically don't have enough jet fuel at any price. You see U.S. carriers are also taking a financial hit. That's something that will probably hit before the end of the month. And without the strait being fully open, and that means both sides, that's going to be a problem. How are we going to mitigate that?
Well, I don't think we can, frankly, unless we wise up and essentially disengage from the war. One of the things I wrote recently was the importance now for the United States, as well as for virtually all the nations of the world, to start building towards resource sovereignty. What we're saying is that access to food, fuel, feed, fertilizer, precious metals, and minerals can't depend on distant choke points anymore. The days when the United States Navy secured global seaways are over. I mean, that's the principal defeat. He says the United States Navy is doing a brilliant job controlling the strait. Well, it's parked outside of the strait, far enough away that if it's taken under attack, it has a chance to avoid being struck. What is the U.S. Navy actually doing other than harming the global economy and our own? It certainly isn't helping us in terms of our national security. So I think ultimately what happens in the Gulf is that the non-Western world, Iran and other countries in the region, as well as around the world, will resolve the situation in the Gulf, not us.
And you talk about resource sovereignty here. One of the things about Iran is that they are largely self-contained. Is that they have the natural resources they have access here through the northern sea route here. They have lots of farmland, et cetera, where they can grow most of their own food. They have water. They obviously have petroleum resources. So even if you blockade everything, even if somehow you cut all these land routes, which we can't, not even close to having resources to even attempt that, much less succeed, you're not going to strangle them out, because they do have a version of resource in sovereignty that others don't have. And that leads to them being able to make statements or demands, I think, like these that they're doing right now, which is basically, we're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz until you correct your behavior, which they define as you must never threaten Iran again, permanently end the war, and with its allies in the region, lift the naval blockade, withdraw forces from the region, completely compensate Iran, and release our foreign assets, which is everything from the memorandum of understanding, but all up front. Instead of before, there was, I think, only three main things that we had to do: drop the blockade, release sanctions, and then provide frozen funds, which we didn't do. But everything else was supposed to be negotiated. Now they're saying all the things to negotiate have to be up front, or they're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. And the question is, with that resource sovereignty to whatever degree, is that enough for them to maintain that even with a blockade longer than we can?
Well, remember that Iran is a continental power, which means that it has support and sustainment coming into it from Russia as well as China. We're a maritime power. Whatever we do has to go 6,000 miles, largely by ship and secondarily by air. And the bases that we're operating from are no longer bases in close proximity to Iran, which means that we've got that much further to go than we normally would, whether it's to launch strikes or to conduct surveillance or anything else. I think there are a couple of other things that we should mention. There's a book called by Norman Davies, and it's a book about World War II, and it's really worth reading. And it compares what happened during the war between Germany, Russia, or the Soviet Union and ourselves. And when you look at that and you fast forward into the current environment, you understand something. Iran can withstand a lot more damage. Their standard of living is not nearly as high as ours. If it suffers, it's not going to be as acutely felt in Iran as it is going to be felt here in the United States. The other thing is that Iran is in an existential war, much like the Soviet Union and Germany were. We're not in an existential conflict. We haven't even declared war, which is not a minor consideration. Then you've got to add something else. The Houthis inside Al-Ansarah have now attacked Saudi Arabia's shipping in the Red Sea. The Saudis aren't moving anything out of Yanbu. They can turn around and destroy Yanbu if they decide to do it. And they can also reach oil infrastructure as well from southern Yemen. So I guess my point is, from a purely strategic calculus standpoint, the Iranians, in Donald Trump's words, hold all the cards, Dan. We don't hold any at this point. And in the meantime, the rest of the world, especially in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, is rearranging itself in real time. You now have this new alliance between Saudi Arabia. I don't want to say alliance, but it's clearly a security alignment between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. My understanding is that the Egyptians are now under a lot of pressure to join it. And I think there's a lot of evidence that they may well do that. So that means the largest, most powerful Sunni Muslim Arab states, plus the Turks, plus Pakistan, will be aligned against Israel. I mean, absolutely, unquestioningly aligned against Israel, and secondarily against us. And it's not a direct attack on us, but it's a recognition that we've demonstrated we can't protect anybody in the Gulf. And as a result, they're going to form an alliance that's designed to protect them on their own without help from us. So I think this new Turkey, Saudi, Paki, potentially Egypt defense pact is crafted to halt Greater Israel and replace us in the Gulf.
And one of those constraints, you talked about resource sovereignty. We don't seem to even have that because our resources in the military realm are running low. There was an interesting exchange on Fox News yesterday, not in the direction you might think, although some of those are coming, with Dan Hoffman, former CIA station chief that's on a lot of national security issues. And in this exchange here, he's going to use a lot of the buzzwords about how bad Iran is and they're terrible and all this stuff. But listen pretty carefully, because he's going to admit something here, that there is a major shortfall in our military resource in the absence of sovereignty because of our defense industrial base from 10 years ago.
We could draw the inference that we're pausing on military strikes, perhaps because some of our stocks have been depleted. What I would emphasize from my experience serving in the intelligence community and deployed overseas for years in war zones with the U.S. military, this is not like a water faucet that you can turn on. If we're talking about our defense industrial base, this is something we want to build out, we should have been building out 10 years ago. And so if the Trump administration is doing this now, and Deputy Secretary Steve Feinberg has taken the lead, and that's good because he's had extraordinary experience and success in the private sector, that will be good for 3-4 years down the road. We need to do this, and the Congress needs to be briefed, and they need to be supportive, I think, of what is an astronomically high defense budget, but it looks like it's something that we need to be doing.
Now, he also went on to talk about the debt that we have, and I'll talk about that separately because that affects it. But he's admitting here now that, and this is something you've always said, even on our show and in your books, that you want to, the army, the military that you want to go to war with, you had better been starting it 10 years before, because that's how long it takes to bring these things into account. He's talking about just the defense industrial base is 3 years or more away from even having an effect on what's going on now. But Doug, we just talked about, we've got 3 or 4 weeks to make some kind of a decision here, or we're going to be in a world of financial hurt.
Well, Hoffman and Feinberg are both Israeli firsters. So they're going to find an excuse to do whatever is possible to pour more money into this war against Iran, and for that matter, into any conflict that is either anti-Russian, anti-Iranian, and for the most part, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, let's put it that way, in the region. We have no interest in that as a country. There's no reason why we should be engaged in any of those things. So let's get that straight. Secondly, yes, he's telling us now things that we said a very long time ago. I don't know how many times I've written it, and I wrote it because I was being told these things by friends in the industry, friends in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, GD. We have no surge capacity, none. That's something that we lost a long time ago, and no one cared. And the biggest problem we have is that the whole force posture is designed for the short war. It's designed to essentially beat down weak opponents that have little to no air and missile defense, and certainly no significant naval or Air Force capability. Those days are over. And what Iran marks is a fundamental sea change in the history of international relations. Iran is a former great power in the form of Persia. It now has the human capital as well as the scientific industrial knowledge to build enormous quantities of missiles, long, medium range, strike, tactical ballistic missiles, unmanned systems, whatever it is, within the framework of this new technology for space-based surveillance. It gives you persistent surveillance and instant targeting data. This is a revolution for which we were completely unprepared. We should have been, because you and others and I have talked about what was done under Surovikin when he established the strategic defense at the end of 2022 that had inflicted such terrible damage on the Ukrainians and made it impossible for the Ukrainians to mass any significant numbers of forces. And whenever they did, they lost them. We paid no attention to that. And we assumed from the outset that Iran was not what it is. Iran was a weak power. Iran was incapable of withstanding the might of the United States military. All this sort of self-congratulatory, narcissistic crap. All of that has fallen short. We should be disengaging. We should be returning home, focused on what's important here, and studying carefully what we need to do for the future. Because right now, we're not really postured in a different way. We haven't fundamentally rethought the structure. We haven't raised any of the critical questions. Where do we fight? How do we fight? How do we get there? With whom? And so forth. All of those things had to be answered differently now and from now on. And Feinberg's not going to do that. Hoffman certainly won't. Nobody in the administration will. They're all focused on one thing. And this is the problem when everybody says, well, why doesn't Donald Trump simply recognize the futility of continuing and end it? Well, how does he explain that to the people that put him in office? How does he explain that to the people that control the House, the Senate, and the White House?
Well, he could explain to them by saying physical constraints prohibit us from doing that without basically committing national suicide. We'll see how that's going to work out. But sticking with this part about here, okay, there's no surge capacity that exists. They've tried to, and it's just incrementally moved out a little bit. But even Hoffman later in that same interview said, listen, even that's something in the next 2 to 3 years is going to be hard enough because we already have nearly $40 trillion debt hanging over us, and you just can't keep adding to that without eventually that collapsing on top of us. Or do you think he's wrong? Can we literally just forever keep adding to the national debt?
No, we can't. But what people will ask you, and this is where Nassim Taleb, he talks about the black swan, these events. And what he'll tell you is that we have a swimming pool full of black swans right now. We don't know when they're all going to take off, but they're all primed and ready to fly, which means that you could have a number of different kinds of bubbles and collapses in the financial system, the banking system, the treasury markets. We've seen the beginning of this in Japan. We're watching this slow global fracturing and meltdown in the Western financial system. So everybody will say, well, when's it really going to break? When's it really going to hit? And everybody will tell you the same thing. Nobody really knows. But I think most of us, and I'm talking about people that I trust, whether it's someone like Ray Dalio or Luke Roman or Jeffrey Gundlach, Alistair McLeod. I mean, we go down the list. All of these people are very bright, thoughtful analysts, and they say it's coming, and it's coming soon. I would think that President Trump is increasingly aware of that. If he wasn't, he would never have said what he did in Paris. I'm not going to end up like Herbert Hoover. I know the global economy could go into a depression. That's why we must open the strait. Well, obviously, he gets it. He understands. So we're back to the critical question, Dan. Why isn't he responding appropriately? Why is he essentially dragging us into a protracted war? Because people like Hoffman and Feinberg and others in the White House and on the Hill, they want a protracted conflict. They don't understand the consequences for us as a country, let alone the rest of the world. They're only thinking about their interests and Israel's. And their interests and Israel's demand a protracted war. But we can't do it. That's the bottom line. I wonder how long it's going to take before President Trump figures that out, because you and I know there's a lot of evidence for a lot of unhappy people in the armed forces right now who've had to live under miserable conditions at sea for months and months and months. You get at some point revolts, rebellions. And I don't know if we'll get it, but it's not impossible. I mean, nobody that's been to sea for any length of time can appreciate how bad it is right now in the Indian.
Well, one has to ask the question, though, a lot of these people who say they want these open-ended conflict and they whatever for Israel's interest or whatever it is, they still are not stupid people. They may be greedy, but they're not stupid, and they should be able to see this. I mean, with Dan Hoffman's even admitting some of this stuff, because that was one of the more tame ones that he said in the last few months here, but that is not tame from coming from somebody like, well, Mike Pompeo.
The president was talking in the middle of the week about how we were very close to a deal. I think you can see we're not remotely close to that. The Iranians are not yet willing to give up because they're not business people, because they want to destroy Israel and the United States of America. And so the blockade will have to continue, not to put pressure on the Iranian people, but to put pressure on the regime itself. And I think that's the path that President Trump has chosen to go down. One of the objectives I know President Trump is driving towards is getting energy prices back to normal, getting the strait actually opened. While I agree with the president that we're in control of who's coming in and who's coming out, it's not free commercial travel there today. It's just, you can see it by the insurers' unwillingness to insure ships that are moving through the strait. To get back to that place that we want to, I think it's going to take more than just economic pressure. I think it's going to take more continued military efforts as well. And I think the president will come to that same conclusion.
Yeah, so he's still obviously saying that going back to war. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Do you think he actually does believe that, yeah, we just need to go back to military and that will force the Iran open?
He believes what his donors tell him, and he will do what his donors want him to do. He's in a position very similar to President Trump. He's on the payroll. He's part of the group. This man is not going to back away from any action, regardless of how stupid it is, let alone stand up and make it clear that we as Americans have no strategic interest in this war. We're not interested in going to war with virtually everybody in the region. We're not interested in killing Muslims everywhere. We're not interested in killing anybody anywhere at this point. There's no reason why we should be. I mean, these are the kinds of people that have been telling us for years, nuclear warheads are on their way in Iran. Soon they'll be on missiles. And then New York City and Los Angeles are at risk. You know, it takes me back to the 1960s. Why didn't Lyndon Baines Johnson nuke China when we identified that they had nuclear facilities? What made China different from everyone else so that he wasn't necessarily concerned about that? And why did Richard Nixon refuse to join Brezhnev in a joint Soviet-American strike against Chinese nuclear development? I mean, why not? Because it's insane. You don't precipitate wars over nuclear weapons and with nuclear weapons. You don't do it. You know, if you do, it will lead to a larger conflagration. Now, the one thing we can say with absolute certainty is that all of the demands that Pompeo and the rest of these people have made on behalf of their mentors and sponsors and donors in the Israel lobby, if you want to call it that, they have said repeatedly all sorts of things, all of which were lies, all of which were wrong and made no sense. They're not going to back off from it right now. But none of it makes sense for us. It never did. And we don't need to be part of this. I think that's why the polls reflect what they do. I was talking to a friend the other day who's Jewish, and he said, don't you think these polls that suggest that more than 70% of the American people oppose the war indicate that anti-Semitism is on the rise? I said, well, I wouldn't be surprised if anti-Semitism isn't on the rise for a whole range of reasons right now connected with this government and our foreign and domestic policy. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the real issue is that Americans see no reason for this. They don't buy it. And when this hits them financially and economically over the next several months, it's going to be hell to pay in Washington. It'll be really very interesting to see how people jump off this sinking Titanic that President Trump sadly has made himself captain of, because that's what he's on. That's why I said he's writing the book, The Art of Defeat. It's tragic. It's unnecessary. I think he knows that, but he can't get out.
Well, he might need to want to try to figure that out pretty soon. Interesting, you mentioned some of what the polls say about the American people. As it turns out, we're going to have pollster Rich Barris on the show later this afternoon at 3 p.m., and he's going to be telling us graphically exactly what the real polls say. He's one of the best there is in the industry at cutting through all the political left or right slant that so many polls get to actually tell you what people are thinking, and I think you are aware of what he's going to discuss there. I want to get back to one of the things that Pompeo said there, because it kind of related to what you just said there about how the people, you think that the really people are moving against something else because they see these things aren't necessary. That's why they're turning against this war in historic numbers to this early of a stage than we ever have, I think, even including World War II. I mean, you go all the way back, and nothing has been as bad as this one is, and that is including the 2003 Iraq War, by the way. And then it's just the fact that Pompeo demonizes the other side so that they're not rational actors. They're not somebody you can make a deal with. They're theocratic thugs, and they just are hell bent on the destruction of our country, and they want to drive us out of the region, Israel out of the region, etc. Is that starting, do you think, also to fall on deaf ears, that people say, look, the Iranians, they actually kind of sound like rational actors, and what they're saying kind of makes sense. They don't seem like these irrational people that Pompeo wants them to be held into.
Well, let's be frank. The people in Washington don't have the gift of seeing themselves through the eyes of others. In other words, we don't really bother to stop and consider what the impact of what we say and do has on people overseas. We live in isolation in this bubble. Some people like to call it Versailles on the Potomac. In any case, they're not thinking about it, and they really need to, because the American people, they're not really familiar with the details on places like Venezuela or Nigeria, Kenya, Yemen, Thailand, Vietnam. I mean, we don't have a population that frankly has any reason to know a great deal about those places. But what they have figured out, which is different from what we had in the past, is that we're expending enormous quantities of money and time, resources. We're also losing lives, and it doesn't make any sense. Remember, in Vietnam, there was this underlying consensus in the United States: communism is bad, communism is dangerous. Well, the APAC, neocon globalists have tried to equate anyone opposed to them and their agenda, whether they're an Islamic State in the Middle East or Russia or China or anyone else, as similar to the communist threat. No, Dan, I don't think it's worked. I think people don't understand that's nonsense. By the time Vietnam ended, everybody understood, just because we packed up our gear and came home, millions of Vietnamese communists were not going to build ships and float across the Pacific to attack California. I mean, this is the sort of nonsense. You were in Iraq, and you remember, this is back in 2004, when Abizaid stood in front of the cameras and said, if we don't stop them now here, then we'll be fighting them in the United States. It's crap. It's the same nonsense. It's a big lie. That's what Americans have figured out. It's a big lie. And I don't think our major institutions really have much credibility anymore. The people on top of them don't. Somebody said every institution is always the measure of a man. And I think if you look at the Department of Defense, certainly in the decades after World War II, it was George Marshall who was the measure of defense. Well, he's long since gone. Most people don't know who he was and could care less. What have you got now? You look at the people at the top, and people are saying, who are these people? And why should we listen to them? They don't make any sense. So I think everything has changed, frankly. The longer Donald Trump persists in this, the greater the consequences for him, our economy, and our country. But again, somebody's got control of him. I think we know that it certainly isn't the FBI. I don't know who does, but they're not letting him off, and he can't just walk out. Look, he hasn't been able to divorce us from Ukraine, even though he knows and has known for some time Ukraine's a catastrophe. All we can do is feed more human lives into the Russian meat grinder. Ukraine has no chance of winning anything. And whatever damage they're supposed to do to Russia shrinks to insignificance next to the damage that's being done to Ukraine and Europe. Imagine being a German right now and recognizing it was the United States and United States power and influence that destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. You're watching hundreds of thousands of people walk away from monumental enterprises like Volkswagen. And you're asking, what are we doing? The greatest chemical industry in the world was always in Germany. Optics. I mean, we just go down the list. Precision engineering, everything. It's all being destroyed. In the name of what? In the name of diversity? In the name of Russia is bad, we won't buy their gas? I mean, this is all insane. It's all coming together.
Yeah, and we're actually going to have Marjorie Taylor Greene on later this afternoon, actually about 1 o'clock, and she's actually going to be talking about some of that very thing there from what she observed from the inside of Trump world. So that'll be an interesting, well, certainly some questions we'll ask her. One other thing on this current topic I want to get your view on, because it's if Pompeo was kind of, I mean, it's loosely, we can say he was a diplomat. He was one in name only, but General Jack Keane wants to basically pick up the script that Pompeo is reading from and actually wants to go a little further.
I understand the economic pressure, and we talk about it in terms that we're used to dealing with. The amount of revenue they're losing every day, spiraling inflation, currency devaluation, all the things that we look at anybody's economy. And reasonable people would come to the conclusion they can't stand this. They're going to collapse eventually. They're going to eventually bend to our will. I don't think so. And the reason is this is a diabolical tyranny-based terrain that has an ideology to destroy the state of Israel and drive the United States out of the region, and they want to take control. Eventually, President Trump will combine military force and what Secretary Bessent is doing. Yes. And at that point, when we do that, we will bend Iran to our will.
Bend Iran to our will. What do you think of that, Doug? Is that coming?
I think General Keane and probably some of his retired general friends are looking at the possibility of living in villas, sitting on the former territory of Gaza, gazing out at the Mediterranean once Greater Israel is established. I really think these people are living a fantasy. And of course, I know Larry Kudlow is, but he lives in fantasy world. Remember, this is New York City. That's an extension of Israeli Zionist Jewish power. And so that's the seed of it. From his standpoint, there's no alternative but the complete and total annihilation of Iran. And that's what he's plugging for. And I think that's what General Keane wants. I go back again to the question, is it in the interest of the American people to annihilate Iran as a great power? Is that really something that's vital to our strategic interest? And now we talked earlier about the Turkish, Saudi, Pakistani alliance that could eventually, and perhaps sooner than later, include Egypt as this fundamentally anti-Israeli alliance designed to protect what is in the region from the Greater Israel Project, and obviously our support. You also have the other alliance in name, not necessarily in name, but in practice, and that's Russia, Iran, and China. And they've all made it very clear that they're not going to stand around and tolerate the annihilation of the Iranian state. So how does this help us as a country to be engaged in this self-defeating enterprise? We gain nothing from it. The only thing we'll end up with is splendid isolation that isn't very splendid, because originally isolationism was only about staying out of other people's wars. We're putting ourselves in a position where that resource sovereignty is going to become absolutely vital, because large numbers of people in the world won't want to do any business with us.
Yeah, that it's hard to see how we're going to avoid that, and there's none of the trend lines are moving in that good direction here. I want to shift over to the Russia-Ukraine war, because you mentioned that a second ago, and you really can't talk about either one of these in isolation, as you have written about on your Substack, about how these are becoming one war here. And let's take a look at some of that stuff. The narrative is still very puzzling. Now, this is from the Associated Press. I think it was published yesterday. Trump told Ukraine it had no cards, and then Kiev took the war to Russia. When you get into the details of that, it says Kiev has ramped up a campaign of longer-range strikes inside of Russia and in areas Moscow has seized. Pardon me. Increased production of weapons, targeted Russian air defenses, and hit oil infrastructure and the warehouses of major retailer in a bid to ensure ordinary Russians feel the impact of the conflict. Now, much of that is per se accurate, is they certainly have done those things. They have hit those targets. But then the real question is, does that lead to a war termination or a shift in the direction of the war away from Moscow and towards Kiev, such that at some point that Moscow will go, you know what, that's enough pain. I guess we're going to have to settle on your terms. What do you say?
Well, first, I think we're looking at a 40% reduction, or we're looking at a week or two ago, in Russia's capacity to refine oil, petroleum, for various products. this has not really hurt Russia very much. A lot of that damage is rapidly repaired. Refineries are very large, very robust structures. They're not easily destroyed. It takes a lot more effort than what the Ukrainians are able to mobilize, frankly. But having said that, has this had an impact on decision making at the highest levels in Moscow, which I think is the real question. As I talk to people that are coming back from Russia and read what's translated from the Russian media and from their television, I would say Russians are universally very angry, not at President Putin. They're angry at what's being done to them. And increasingly, they blame the West because they know the Ukrainians can't manufacture these weapons. And they're not. They're taking components that come in from the West. They're assembling them. Sometimes they modify them, sometimes they're not. And then they launch them. Unmanned and unmanned systems, similar to what the Iranians produced. And also they're launching tactical, not really tactical, but medium range missiles. And some people are saying they're going to get long range missiles. If they do, again, that has to come from Great Britain, France, Germany, potentially other countries. Now, that's very dangerous. Fortunately for us, we do not have a madman in the Kremlin. He is much more balanced and rational than we give him credit for being. He's not interested in a war with the West. He wants to do business with the West. He wants to get this thing over with. He wants to be sure that when the war ends, that he and the Europeans can still do business with each other. We're getting very close to radical change politically in a place like Germany and France. Let me stop for a minute and talk about this. There have been meetings outside of Germany in third countries between Russians and Social Democrats. You have to understand the Social Democratic Party is one of the oldest in Germany, dates back to the 1860s and 70s. And they are now contemplating quietly a potential alliance with the alternative for Germany, something which everybody says is impossible and could never happen. Well, they're rethinking this because they have reached a point where in the context of future politics, they're almost irrelevant. And historically, the Social Democrats have always been far more, I don't want to say pro-Soviet at the time, but certainly more understanding towards Moscow at that point. And I think even now, privately more willing to do business with Moscow than the others. That sort of thing could change everything overnight. That could suddenly take Germany out of this entire mess. And the Germans are fed up. There's strong undercurrents for getting out of not just the European Union, but NATO. So I still think that there's a willingness in Moscow to wait for this. Macron is it's astonishing that he's still where he is. I don't know how much longer he'll be there. The point is, we've been waiting for this sort of upheaval that's coming to manifest itself. I think it's on its way. We're going to witness it. That's going to change things. And the question is, can Moscow exercise the restraint and the patience it needs to get there? That's the first. Second, they've already got concentrations of forces that they can move very rapidly to take Odessa and also Kharkov. And I think they would want to do that before they go for Kiev. And going into Kiev is not something they necessarily want to do. It's something they would feel compelled to do because there's no guarantee that any agreement they reach with any government in Kiev right now is going to produce anything they can rely on for the future. And they just don't want to go back to war again in 5 or 10 or 15 years.
And, look, there's some very practical things that are moving in that direction. You mentioned Odessa. This just shows how the air wars continue to happen. This was day before yesterday where there was a massive attack against Odessa. And it's pretty much already shut down as an effective deep sea port there in the Black Sea. So that continues on. And then that's going on with what's happening in the capital city where there's not even the pretense that they have any air defense. And I was talking to somebody that I know that has direct access into even the government level in Ukraine. And they said, listen, if you're seeing that in Kiev, you can imagine everywhere else, especially in the front line, they don't have any defenses on anything. Some areas, they said, got like one Patriot missile per day. that they had, which obviously is meaningless in the terms of air defense. They said against the glide bombs that Russia has, there is no defense. And even Patriots, they don't even hit that kind of target. So they are utterly defenseless in the air, whether it's those drones, now missiles. Where is that going to leave Ukraine? Upon what basis does somebody like the Associated Press say, hey, Kiev took it to Russia and that's going to work, when at least Russia has air defense and they can knock down a majority of things that are sent in there? How does that work?
Well, I think it makes Ukraine ungovernable. It turns it into a rubble pile. It destroys whatever is left of its agriculture, whatever little industry they have. And so Ukraine becomes a dead state. I think it's already a zombie country. It's got a facade for a government. It's mired in more corruption than we can even begin to imagine. I think Europeans, particularly those that live on the border, the Poles know that, which is why the attitude in Poland has changed so radically. That's why the Polish government now says there will be no more aid in terms of Polish advice or support or military assistance. I think the Hungarians understand this, the Slovaks do. These are the countries that border Russia. Now, when you go to Lithuania, which borders Ukraine and White Russia, it's a little different. Ukraine has remained steadfastly, violently anti-Russian. Goes back to the Second World War, as so much does, and we don't understand it. But the point is this. Yes, this war will end. It'll end when suddenly no one sends anything else to Ukraine, because there's no one there to accept it other than a few people with their hands out, anxious to climb on a plane and send whatever funds you gave them to banks in Cyprus or Albania or somewhere else. So that's when it's going to end, sadly. Now, in the meantime, the Russians hold the cards. They can move decisively whenever they want to move. They have to deal with the fact that we provide the same kind of, not exactly the same, but certainly substantial overhead-based intelligence and surveillance to the Ukrainians, which allows them to launch precision weapons from time to time at the Russians and do some damage. Enough to win the war? No. Enough to be more than an irritant? Sometimes. But right now, it looks like the Russians have pretty good defenses all up and down the front, and they're moving forward as a consequence. The problem for the Russians, as you point out, is behind the front. It's Russia itself. That's 1,000, 1,100 mile front that you're trying to defend, and they have a lot more in terms of air and missile defense than we do. But it's still very difficult to do that, and that's why a lot of these things get through.
Now, there's an additional development here. This is according to the Ukraine press, the Kiev Post, is it's not just that Ukraine now no longer has defensive missiles to knock anything down from ballistic missiles and hypersonics from Russia, but now Russia is apparently increasing its offensive capacity at the same time. So Russia could soon launch 200 ballistic missiles in a single attack instead of the 70 or so that they've been doing here of late, because their capacity is growing. It's not even that it's more, but it's continuing to escalate. What does that tell you about the course of this war? Maybe what it might look like in Ukraine over the rest of this year?
The Russians could actually concentrate more firepower than that. The reason they haven't is that they are holding much in reserve, because there is still this belief in Russia, even in Moscow, that conceivably Europeans could try to intervene in Western Ukraine. That you could see NATO forces from the Baltic states or Poland or Slovakia or Romania, more likely, move into Western Ukraine. So they're holding a lot of troops in reserve. They've increased the size of their forces dramatically. They're over 1 million. And they've got the equipment, and a lot of people are training right now that as a result of a recent call-up. They can concentrate more, but they're still holding this in reserve. And again, this all goes back to Donald Trump. If Donald Trump, as the leader of NATO, believed in anything he said, this war would have ended a long time ago. But it turns out he doesn't. He's turned out to be the toothless monster, if you will. Instead of being the great gargantuan beast that everyone in Europe thought he was, he's some version of the Cookie Monster. Nothing's changed. He's not really in charge. because the same people that were there under Biden and who were there before Biden, in fact, under Obama, not as many, but almost, and going back to the Bush administration, the same kinds of people have risen to the top and are controlling things now. And they want the war with Russia to continue, and they want the war against Iran and anybody else in the Middle East that opposes Israeli expansion to continue. So that's the tragedy.
Dan, you got to bring yourself in, Dan.
Was out. Sorry about that. Did not realize I was out. I want to spend the last few minutes we have here on something the kind of domestic. I know it's something you pay a lot of attention to, and that is the education of our armed forces. This piece in the American Conservative by Kelly Vlahos, a mutual friend of ours. Do Hegseth's reforms to military universities go far enough? Hegseth came in and he was apparently, really excited about going after wokeness and a bunch of stuff like that. But is it far enough? And is that even the right thing to focus on? What do you think?
Well, it's something that deserves a focus, but there has to be a larger strategic framework. And that doesn't exist right now. It's kind of interesting. I thought it was wonderful that she used the expression of military universities, because I and many of my peers who are familiar with the United States Military Academy at West Point have long since stopped calling it a military academy. It isn't. It's a university where boys and girls wear uniforms and go to classes together. That's about it. The original mission of the military academy was to provide officers for the regular army. The new mission statement talks about leaders for America and all this kind of nonsense. I think all of the military academies have become these kinds of universities. And the question is, do we need them? I'm not interested in funding people's 4-year educations at quote unquote military universities. I want to get back to what are we trying to get out of it? What's the goal? What are we extracting? So that's part of it. The other part is at higher levels. What are we doing to impart really useful knowledge, science, technology, military operations, operational art, all of these things? Well, the problem is we don't hold anyone accountable, Dan. If you show up, you graduate. Now, there are always some people that don't, one or two individuals, usually for reasons that don't have much to do with performance. Sometimes they do, but let us say out of 285 that matriculate at the National Defense University, 285 routinely graduate. Who are we kidding? Is this really a course of instruction? Is something really being learned? The other thing is we have a lot of single service war colleges. Well, I don't think single service warfare is viable anymore. And I think the biggest problem we have is that there's not enough emphasis and understanding of what real integrative operations need to look like in the future. We're still living in the 1947 National Security Act that enshrined really the way the services fought World War II, or at least how they thought it was fought. That's why Eisenhower opposed it. There were a lot of people that didn't like it because it made matters worse. It didn't improve the situation. The bureaucracies at the service level took over, and the rest is history. Congress doesn't care. All they're interested in is where does the money go, and do I benefit from it? Do my constituents, do my donors? So they don't give a damn. I listened to a senator just excoriate Pete Hegseth. Now, you can say what you want about Pete Hegseth. Anybody who's Secretary of Defense is going to be under fire from time to time. He's obviously said some things that are probably unfortunate, but that he's not responsible for everything you're seeing right now. He didn't walk into that institution and somebody didn't walk up and hand him, sir, here's your guidebook. And you need to look at the levels of readiness in the armed forces, in all of the services. You need to look at the combat forces, the mission-focused capability packages. You need to look at the various modernization programs, and you need to look at what we have in our arsenal, what we have sitting on the ground, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, and understand what we're really postured to do, what kind of war we can or cannot fight, and the impact of the last 30 years. Okay. Nobody did that. Nobody did it. Nobody does that. And in most cases, what does the Secretary of Defense do? What does the Secretary of Service do? He shows up, Dan, and he presides. They give him a funny little hat that says SecNav and put little stars on it, or a funny little hat that says boss and SecDef or some other crap. So no one has been asked to look at anything. All they're asked for is a budget with money. And then he comes across and says, well, the wars cost a lot of money. Well, it's your fault because you lost the war. Okay. Well, he has had a role in it. Nobody's going to refute that. But who are you kidding, Senator? What have you done? Have you led any charges lately against illegal wars? Have you raised any constitutional questions?
Great point.
What do you know about the armed forces? What do you know about who commands it, how they get there? You don't know. You don't know anything about these so-called universities and how useless they are. Who the hell are we kidding? This is not professional. I can take you to some surprising places. I could take you to Poland and show you a real General Staff Academy. And I could show you real General Staff students. And you would understand that 10% of the students are probably going to fail. They won't pass the course and become General Staff officers. They will be returned to duty without prejudice. You're not a General Staff officer. You're a very good line officer, and you're still in line for future promotion, but you're not a General Staff officer. You don't get that designation. So after 2 years, we're sorry, farewell, goodbye, good luck. We don't have a system like that. And the reason we don't have it is because the people in it don't want it. I mean, I sat next to people at the Leavenworth Staff College, and they were nice people, but I would say at least half of the group that I was with had no business being there. These people were struggling with how to write an operations order. I mean, are you kidding? That's insane. And they said, well, you know all about this stuff. You need to come and help us. And, the staff group leader said, you need to get in there and help. What is this? Special Olympics in the military? This is outrageous. This is nonsense. But this has been going on for years. And a lot of these guys go on to be generals. Because how do you get there? Well, you get there by never rocking the boat. We know that. And so when it comes to picking people, what do you pick? You pick people not on the basis of what they've done that's especially impressive or outstanding. You pick them on the basis of what they haven't done. Haven't you ever heard the expression? I know I've heard this in many services. Well, he's commanded successfully at every level. And we all sat there and laughed. And what, peacetime?
Right.
Who the hell are we kidding? It's a joke. All of this has got to be addressed. This administration can't do it. And
Mr. Doug, I'll ask the obvious question. Who's qualified to ask those questions or to, other than you? And obviously you've already written a whole slew of books on this stuff, and anyone who wants to can read it. But the outlet pick you. Is there, better question, is there anybody that has the ability or the knowledge to even address the questions?
Yes, there are, both civilian and military. There definitely are. But you have to set out to identify those people. Then you bring them together. You protect them from all the slings and arrows that will be hurled at them from the outside. You sequester them and give them the time and the support to put together the alternatives. In other words, to find the right solutions, to set up ultimately a new structure and a new system. That's what the British did in 1905 until about 1912 under a new Secretary of War after the Boer War. Because even though they won the Boer War, they had to commit 250,000 British troops to take on and fight at any one time no more than about 35,000 Boers. And they performed badly. All right. They won because they had the resources, they had the numbers, and they were ultimately able to open concentration camps and put Boer women and children and old men in them, where 70,000+ of them died of starvation and disease. That's how they won the Boer War. Now, my point is, he knew that. A man, his name was Richard Haldane, very brilliant man, and a lawyer, by the way, with no military experience. But he knew this had to change. And there were a number of people in uniform that also recognized it. And so they did a pretty good job. And that army that came out of that ends up fighting very well in 1914. The problem was it was an army designed for everything but war on the European continent against the Germans. So they all died, but they fought well. And then they were replaced by, millions of citizen soldiers who did the best they could, but they ended up like our citizen soldiers during World War I, but more important, during the Civil War. So, Grant was asked and I'll shut up after this. Grant was asked by a journalist what unit was he most proud of having served with in his career. This is long after he'd retired. And he answered Zachary Taylor's army in the Mexican War. And this man was shocked. And he went on to talk about the fact, Zachary Taylor's army was a professional force. Most of the soldiers we had were professionals. We were augmented, but the core army was a professional force, and they were brilliant. We could outperform, we could outmaneuver the Mexicans, even though they always outnumbered us 3 or 4 to 1. And then he said, you have to understand, what about the Civil War? He said, we have to understand those were citizen soldiers. They were brave and courageous and good men, but it's not the same as a professional force. And what happened during the Civil War? How many men did we lose in frontal attacks in the last year plus of the war in order to bring the war to a close? And people used to call Grant the Butcher. And of course, what he knew is that what else can we do? I only have so many trained professionals. I can only do so much. Now, my point is, we don't want that for the future, but we need to think very carefully about what that future should look like. I think what Secretary Hegseth has suggested, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is, how do you go about it? And remember, none of these institutions, nor the people in charge of them, can reform themselves.
All right. Yes, that's a fact. And I don't know how we're going to get somebody in there that's qualified. I'm glad to know there are other folks, but we're going to have to do something to start getting them elevated. And that requires somebody at the top willing to do it. And so far, we don't have that. So we're just going to have to hope that shows up.
Not just the guy at the top. Unfortunately, you have to get Congress on board. And these are people with no interest or understanding. That's bad news. But you got to get them on board, because if they won't support it, they can sabotage it.
They won't. And if and the only other alternative is that we get crushed in some future war against something near a peer competitor, and that's the only way you expose it, at least history. That's the only other thing I think, and I'd like to avoid that. But at least we have the blueprint there and the focus that you pointed out to us, and we're so grateful for that. Thank you so much, Doug.